And now to fixing the tax code. We need to start off with establishing how much the government should be taxing, and therefore how much the government should be spending, just overall, total federal, state, and local spending all together. And typically this argument is actually framed in the terms of directional arguments and a binary, which the binaries always suck, but the binary is tax cuts or tax hikes, raise or low, like increase or decrease. The problem is they're both directional, which means if you think that cutting taxes and letting the private sector have more of its money, letting individuals have more consuming power, and thus increasing consumption or increasing investment in the marketplace, giving the private sector more of its own money to spend, that those tax cuts grow the economy. Or on the other side, tax hikes, that increasing taxes, taking more money from people and having the government strategically invest that money, that grows the economy faster. Or having them redistribute that money and then growing consumption in that way, that will grow the economy faster. The problem with both of these arguments is they have truth to them, but they're directional and they find a limit. If you increase taxes to 100%, the economy will collapse, you'll have no tax revenue, and you will have no system. If you bring the tax rates down to 0%, you'll be able to run your government as long as you can off of debt, and then eventually the currency will dilute too much, or the whole system is going to fall apart, and that doesn't work either. Sorry. Having a 0% tax rate also obviously doesn't work. You're not generating tax revenue. You'll go into debt so much that you'll inflate your currency, and you'll just collapse the economy from excess inflation. So both of those directional arguments just don't hold water. Now, getting back to my original point, how much should we be taxed? The answer to that is actually very obvious if you look at the data. When government goes from spending 0% to 25% of GDP per year, the GDP growth rate grows right along with it, because having those basic government institutions like courts and police and contract enforcement and infrastructure and a military and all those kinds of things, those create the stability that allow an economy to exist in the first place. In war-torn, constantly just violently being overthrown countries, you're not going to have a stable economy. It's just not going to work. So from 0% to 25%, the economy grows as government spending increases. From 25% to 30%, you have a neutral effect, and growth goes from 0% to 6% and then stays at 6% between 25 and 30% of GDP. As government spending goes beyond 30% of GDP, it has a diminishing effect and growth slows down. Right now we're spending about 38-40% before COVID and the shutdowns in this year. Before all this, and before we spent all this money, we were spending about 38% of GDP, which means that the economy would, as it would predict, would grow at around 3%. We were growing a little bit below that because we had some other issues slowing down our growth economically. So the answer to the question, how much should we be taxed, is 25 to 30% of GDP. Now, I believe in balancing data with values, because you have that range, so you have to decide within that range. I believe that life is inherently valuable, human life is inherently valuable, and thus labor is inherently valuable. So people that give up their labor in exchange for money should keep as much of that money and their life as possible. So I go to 25% within that range of 25 to 30%. But then we have the next question of how do we collect how do we collect that tax revenue? And there's basically three massive categories of taxes that we have to choose from: progressive taxes, flat taxes, and regressive taxes. So progressive, flat, and regressive taxes. Progressive taxes, everyone knows, rich pay a higher percentage of their income than poor people. Flat tax, same percentage of income for everybody. And then regressive taxes are where poor people pay a higher percentage of their income than rich people. And those are real taxes, and they really do exist. So in terms of the flat tax, if you convert that 25% of GDP into a flat tax, it's almost a 30% income tax, which is just too much for poor people to be able to handle. And also, by taking 30% of money away from poor people, not only is it too much of a burden for them to bear, but it will eat into their consuming power and it will actually hurt the economy. So a flat tax is out. Although I do like a flat tax because it adheres to equality under the law. And that leaves us with regressive or progressive. Now, obviously, regressive taxes are out, and I'll get to those. I'll get to those right now. Regressive taxes fall into one of two basic types of structures. They're a flat fee or a percentage charge. So flat fees are fees at the DMV, or if you get a ticket, you pay a certain fee. And for those tickets, I think we should just have hours of voluntary service being the mandatory side, and there being no actual money being charged for tickets. Because right now, rich people can just pay off tickets with very little concern, whereas poor people are seriously economically burdened by those tickets because it's a completely regressive, very regressive tax. But then you also have percentage charges on top of certain commodities or products. So you have the sales tax, you have sin taxes on cigarettes, you have fees at the DMV, like I said, you have gas taxes, you have the value added tax, you have luxury taxes, you have property taxes, registration fees at the DMV for your car. I probably already said that. All of these add to the cost of living. They all eat away at consumption, and they all burden poor people disproportionately. And for those three reasons, they need to go. But even beyond that, if you get to specific ones like the sin tax, you're actually targeting someone who buys cigarettes or is addicted to cigarettes and taxing them more because of that addiction or because of that habit. It totally violates equality under the law, that particular one. The gas tax is the argument for the gas tax is that it'll decrease the amount of gas that we use because it increased the cost. Well, it's burdening everyday people, and things like increasing innovations in technology will go a lot further to reducing our consumption of gas, and you're hurting poor people in the interim. So that needs to go. All those regressive taxes need to go. Property taxes in particular are really bad, and registration fees on cars, because what they do is they effectively make it more expensive to own a home or to own a car, which means that poor people, it's more out of the reach for poor people to get those things because they're making it artificially more expensive. Same thing with the sales tax on all goods and services that the sales tax applies to. So all of those regressive taxes need to go. Then that leaves us with progressive taxes. That's the only option we have on the table. It's not a perfect option, but I have a couple ideas for correcting the imperfections within the attempt to enforce a logical progressive tax system. The problems are, first off, the brackets are arbitrary. No one has any real way of picking those brackets, and the rates of those brackets are also arbitrary. No one has there's no real way to pick one or the other. So those are problems you're kind of left with. And also, all of those brackets and all of those rates are constantly becoming more and more regressive because of inflation, because the real value of those wages is constantly going down. The progressiveness of the tax system is being decreased by inflation. So we need a progressive tax system that will counterbalance for inflation, and we need something that hopefully is not as arbitrary in terms of tax brackets or in terms of rates. Now, in terms of getting rid of the arbitrariness of the brackets and getting rid of the inflation concern, I would suggest that we should go with an average income tax. Or I'm sorry, the tax bracket should be based off of below and above average income. Now, to solve, and that average income will self-adjust, and as income inequality increases, it'll slide up further the scale, so it self-adjusts with economic inequality. It's the perfect metric to use for the tax brackets. Now, in terms of the rates, I would suggest this. So below average income and above average income is equal in terms of the number of dollars that are there. So if you have a flat tax at that average income rate, the amount of tax revenue that's generated below and above that rate is equal, 50-50. But I would argue that we should change the system so that that flat tax for below average income is changed to 15%, cut in half. So it only generates 25% of tax revenue. And then if you take the above average income, and average income is about 60 grand a year, if you take that above average income and you increase it by 50%, you'll get 75% of revenue from the top half and 25% from the bottom half. So non-arbitrary categories, above and below average income, and then self-adjusting 3-to-1 ratio progressive tax system. That's the only tax system that we need. Except for other types of income that will also be turned into that 3-to-1 ratio progressive tax system. So yeah. Now, separate from those three basic categories, we have a whole other sort of range of taxes that are systemic / business taxes. And I'm going to go through them all, just explaining what we need to do to them, because unfortunately, especially with like rich people taxes, people use that as a political weapon, saying tax cuts for the rich. But if you're referring to a variety of different taxes that have a variety of different policy prescriptions, you're conflating a bunch of stuff, and it's a stupid political weapon. So toss that out. I'm going to go one by one and explain what they are and what the policy change should be. First one is the payroll tax I mentioned earlier, I think. The payroll tax is a dual tax. It taxes employers and employees 7.65% of their income. Or in the case of the employer, it charges them 7.65% of the income of the people that they're paying on payroll. So on the business side, it's a regressive business tax because it's increasing the cost of all labor in America by 7.65%, which that added cost represents a bigger percentage of profits for small businesses as opposed to big businesses, so it's regressive. But it also makes American labor more expensive, so it creates an inherent disadvantage for American labor in the global marketplace. So that's terrible. That's bad. We need to cut that part out, and that is equal, in 2019 numbers, that's equal to about $1.4 trillion a year of tax revenue. So that's a lot of money that businesses will no longer will no longer be burdening businesses, and that they can go elsewhere, go to income or go to whatever it is. So the payroll income tax on that side needs to be completely eliminated. And then on the other side, you have employees paying a 7.65% income tax, flat income tax. So I'm against it because it's just a flat income tax structurally, and I already talked about what I would want to do with that. But also, that's another $1.4 trillion that could be going in and being that could turn into additional consumption in the marketplace. So I'm all for getting rid of the payroll tax. And Trump's deferral of the payroll tax is genius because it will help massively increase the money that businesses have and the money that people have to spend. So it increases consumption, increases all the things that businesses can do with their money, and creates a massive incentive to invest and to grow right now during this year. And then they're going to make up for it later. That's why it's a deferral, but hopefully we'll actually get a permanent payroll tax cut, and that will be tremendous for the economy. Another example of one of these kinds of taxes is the corporate income tax. So the corporate income tax is just taxing profits of corporations. And the problem with this is it's a double tax, meaning that money will eventually be taxed as personal income, or it will go into the economy and grow the economy and then turn into jobs and then create tax revenue down the road. So businesses can use their profits to pay dividends out to shareholders. That should be taxed as income. They can increase bonuses or pay more to their regular workers and stuff, or their executives or their board members. That will be taxed as income. Then you have stock buybacks, which is when a company buys its own stock. That should be illegal. That's basically corporate insider trading. It's a business using its earnings, using its profits to inflate the value of its stock, but the value of its stock is determined based off of its earnings. So it's total economic perversion and totally useless. It needs to be made illegal. And then the fourth thing they can do with profits is just reinvest it into the business, like I said. So we make stock buybacks illegal, and then we get rid of the corporate income tax altogether. And people argue or complain that big corporations aren't paying enough. They shouldn't be paying any. Right now, we have those corporate tax rates. The big guys are not paying anything, and the small guys are taking all of the burden. So we need to stop burdening small businesses in this land of giants and get rid of the corporate income tax altogether. The next one is the capital gains tax, and it's very straightforward. If you own something, if your stock or your house or your business grows in value, that is a capital gain. There's two types of capital gains. There's realized capital gains and unrealized capital gains. Unrealized capital gains means you have a house, you bought it for 100 grand. It's now worth 200 grand, but you're just living in it and you haven't sold it, so you haven't made that 100 grand off of a sale. That's an unrealized capital gain. A realized capital gain is you sold the house and now you have 100 grand in your pocket, and that is income. Unrealized capital gains are not income. Realized capital gains are income, and realized capital gains should be taxed as income in a 3-to-1 ratio thing, and unrealized capital gains should have no tax whatsoever. I already explained dividends. Tariffs can be a type of systemic or business tax, but obviously the country that's being tariffed is the one feeling it. But it is just worth noting that it is a type of systemic or business tax. Benefits, mandatory benefits to employees increases the cost of hiring employees, and that is a sort of systemic tax, but it's a regressive one because, again, the laws are complex, but it's a burden on the system, and it's essentially a business tax when you mandate that when you hire someone, you pay this extra stuff for this extra thing. And then you have repatriation. Repatriation is when money has been made overseas and they try to bring it back into the United States. We have a repatriation tax where we tax people for doing that. We're taxing people for bringing their money here to do stuff with it. It's the most stupid tax I've ever heard of. We should have maybe a capital deportation tax, but not a capital repatriation tax. That's insane. So that needs to go to zero. Inflation is a type of systemic tax. I already explained it earlier, but it is costing. It's a tax on all savings and debt, labor, and all that stuff. And then the minimum wage. So I wanted to talk about the minimum wage right now. The minimum wage is a. So the minimum wage is a policy that is often thought of in terms of compassion, but unfortunately that's just not the right way to think about it. Now, what happens when you mandate that the minimum cost of something is X, particularly when it's labor? What that means, say minimum wage is $15 an hour. What that means is that if you do not produce more than $15 an hour of value to an employer, you will not get a job and your industry will never exist. Because obviously if they hire you for X wage and you can't produce more than that value for them, they're losing business, and the business will just fall apart and collapse and be gone. So obviously that's not good. So I'm against the minimum wage for that reason. But the argument that conservatives make that if you increase wages, that increases the cost of goods faster and everyone's poor as a result, that is wrong. That is completely wrong. I'm against the minimum wage, but that argument is completely crap. Mainly because even if you increase the wages for 1 hour of labor, there's more than one unit of output usually per hour for that increased wage. So you have this increase in cost, but it's spread out over several units, so it actually doesn't add up to a whole lot of extra cost. But there's another way of understanding why this doesn't happen. Obviously, it would fall apart if you went from 0 wages to $1. If that's the way things work, then when you went from 0 wages to $1 an hour wages, everything would fall apart, and that obviously didn't happen. But the reason why it also doesn't make sense is because the cost of labor inputs will always be less than the cost of production. So if you increase the labor inputs, the increase as a percentage in the cost of production will always be less. So if labor is half the cost of a bag of chips at 50 cents and the bag of chips is $1, and you increase the cost of labor by 25 cents or 50%, up to 75 cents, then the cost of production has only gone up 25% or 25 cents, but the increased consumption power of that person and that laborer has gone up 50%. So relative to labor, the cost of the good has gone down, despite the inputs going up. So it's not always that obvious. I'm against the minimum wage, but the minimum wage is not Satan, and it's not the worst thing. It's just not ideal and not optimal. Ooh, that got bright real quick, huh? Okay, that's pretty much it. That's walking through almost everything as it relates to fixing the economy. And if we implemented all these policies, we would grow GDP probably at 5 to 7%, which would be incredible. That's like 2.5 to 3.5 times the current growth rate of the growth rate of the Obama years, I should say. So that would be amazing. I just want